pleasure of teaching here for 44 years, and also had the pleasure of having the next speaker in my environmental law seminar, and in my water law course, and in, I think, estates and trusts, so that has nothing to do with today's topic. Sara Parker Pauley is a 93 grad from here, and she went on to do a number of interesting things and ended up as the director of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources. And that is the department that handles the state parks, including it's the Katy Trail, not the MKT Trail. That's a reference both to the same railroad, but the state one is the Katy Trail. That's the nickname of the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railroad. Also handles all of the command and control regulatory statutes, water, air, hazardous waste, solid waste disposal, and so on. And so it is an extremely important department, and she's going to discuss today's topic from the regulatory perspective.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, good afternoon and happy Valentine's Day to everyone. I hope that you guys are better planners than I am and have your cards and flowers already delivered. I have some work to do still this afternoon, so I will try to wrap this up on time. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon, though I have to admit I'm a little depressed after the last presentation. I'm not sure what my job is anymore. So I'm still going to stick with my original script, but it is going to differ quite a bit from yours. I really appreciated your remarks, and I do have some questions for you afterwards. But yeah, that was a very, I guess I would say refreshing approach. I'm not sure I would describe it as refreshing, but very interesting indeed. I do appreciate the opportunity to return to my alma mater and participate in the symposium. Now, when I graduated in 1993 from the law school, we had just recently introduced, and Sherilyn, I'm going to ask you what the title was of the precursor to the journal.
I think it was the Journal of Environmental and Energy Law.
And Energy Law. And so it's had several different iterations, but it's great to participate in this symposium this afternoon. Now, if you had asked me back then what I would be doing some 20 years later, I never would have imagined saying that I was the director of the Missouri Department of Natural Resources, that I was the state's lead environmental regulator. I may have surmised that I would be working for an environmental not-for-profit, some sort of environmental advocacy group. But I don't think I would have thought that the state's lead regulator was a sexy enough choice back then. In essence, I'm not holding my breath for a reality TV show anytime soon lauding the glamour of being an environmental regulator. But you never know. But as I look back now at my resume and the variety of experiences it represents, I realize it has prepared me better than I could have imagined for my current role as the director. Sorry, I'm still learning how to do this. So my professional adventures have included working in both the executive and legislative branches of state government. I've worked both the fish and wildlife side of the house and the environmental regulatory side of the house. I've worked the for-profit and the not-for-profit sectors. I've worked with federal, state, and local governments, and though it appears I cannot keep a job, all of these experiences have helped prepare me to be a regulator. They've allowed me to better understand the complexities of environmental compliance and protection because I have walked in these various paths. In essence, I have walked in the shoes of others. It has also confirmed for me that agencies and nonprofits and the regulated sectors and public citizens, that we all play a critical role in environmental protection, and all of our voices and efforts are needed to ensure effective protection of our natural resources. But yes, there are many challenges along the way, and I have to remind myself often, and especially after the last speaker, that regulatory agencies are a result of the public will. And the public will may change what regulatory agencies look like tomorrow. They certainly have changed in the last 40 years or longer if you look at other types of regulation. And so that is, it's what kept coming to mind, Donald, with some of your remarks, that agencies are changing as a result of that public will. And I think they should, because agencies exist as a result of that public will. But 40-some years ago, at least for the environmental side of the house, longer for the fish and wildlife side of the house, the protection of natural resources was one area where the public did say government should have a role. That because our natural resources belong to all of us, and we all depend upon these resources for our very life and livelihood, that there is a role for government. So, what is it like for me as Missouri's Chief Environmental Regulator? What does that entail? What does a day include? I wish I could have been here this morning to listen to other great speakers. I'm probably going to be repeating a lot or contradicting you unintentionally, but I was busy spending several hours with about 500 or so county commissioners, also telling me that I wasn't doing my job very effectively. So indeed, I wish I could have been here. But especially for those of you who are not from Missouri, maybe I first start by saying Missouri does have, I believe, a little bit of a unique history in that Missourians do have a history of valuing natural resources. We have a constitutionally established conservation department whose mission it is to protect forest, fish, and wildlife. We have a Missouri Department of Natural Resources whose role it is to preserve, protect, and enhance Missouri's natural and cultural resources. And no other state that I'm aware of has two different general sales taxes dedicated and designed to protect natural resources. Twice our citizens, and with the Parks and Soils, of course, it has a sunset, so every 10 years we go back, but 2 different times the citizens have said, tax us. We think it's important enough that these resources go somewhat separate from the appropriation authority of general funds to go to the protection of natural resources. So of course we have the 1/8 of 1 cent sales tax that goes to forest, fish, and wildlife resources, and we have the 1/10 of 1 cent, 50% of that going to parks and 50% going to soil and water conservation efforts. However, we still have a very conservative state. In fact, we often note at the agency that rather than the Show Me State motto, sometimes a more reflective of Missouri might be the Make Me State. Like most states, the Federal Environmental Protection Agency has delegated authority to the Missouri Department of Natural Resources to implement certain federal environmental laws. And I'm sure, as we've talked about throughout the day, the sages that wrote most of our federal environmental laws wisely opted for states to take the lead role in implementing these laws while allowing our federal big brother, the EPA, to have oversight and to provide the attention necessary to ensure that laws are implemented. But also, I'm sure, as has been talked about earlier, these laws are now decades old with antiquated provisions. And the federal funding that comes with these laws often has federal priorities attached to them, not necessarily state priorities. It often comes with strings attached or the federal bean counting that the EPA identifies as important that doesn't necessarily reflect state values. And this funding is declining. And I will say that other more flexible funds, like general funds, our agency, and I've heard it throughout the country from my colleagues, has continued to decline. Our budget is just now under 3% general funds. And so the remainder of our funds tends to be non-flexible funding, both the federal and dedicated fee funds that have to be used for particular purposes. So as we talk about fourth generation and the flexibility required, it does present some challenges for us. So, back to what's it like being the Missouri State Regulator. Well, I also report to a governor who is very engaged in Department of Natural Resource issues. I have a state legislature that is actively engaged in pushing back against the federal government, such as with Medicaid expansion and environmental regulation. We are seeing this, of course, in our neighboring states as well. We have our legislative director here, Mary Mulhern, and she was part of a conversation, I won't mention the senator, but just last week, who said as we were trying to share information with the committee on what a proposed piece of legislation might mean for the agency who actually would implement this particular law, his response was, it is our job to create the laws, it is your job to implement the laws, you should have no say in how laws are created. So, he may have a point, that's interesting, but it's also interesting to note that those agencies responsible for implementation, that our council isn't necessarily always appreciated. As mentioned, we do have regulated sectors such as the agriculture sector, business and industry, and local governments that all have robust lobbying resources active at the state capitol each and every day. We also have environmental groups located across the state that, though maybe not the same in numbers, and certainly the lobbying power often pales in comparison, still they are active as well. I'm sure, as you've talked about, over the last 40 years, we have seen a lot of environmental benefits. We've perhaps taken advantage of what some would call low-hanging fruit with our traditional tools, or the command and control tools. Our stakeholders like to call it PI, permitting, inspection, and enforcement. But we have seen the benefits of that. And as we're thinking about, this is our 40th anniversary at the Department of Natural Resources, we certainly can note the benefits. I think of Fish and Wildlife as well, Department of Conservation created back in the 1930s. And I'm curious and would love to have the conversation of the market-based approach before some of those laws were enacted. It's not the shining example, perhaps, of human nature and how some of our resources were exploited. But what is that natural tension of government's role and the flexible tools to ensure that we are protecting resources? But the challenges I talk about are certainly not unique to Missouri. They're playing out at the federal and the state levels. So with declining resources and outdated tools and more complex environmental issues and political pressures abounding all the more, what are environmental regulators to do? Well, when I visit my counterparts around the country, you will hear some common themes emerging from our discussions. And the Environmental Council of the States is an association of all state environmental regulators. We get together several times a year, and yes, there's a lot of complaining about EPA, complaining about our state legislatures, complaining about declining funding and all of the above. But we talk about the need all the more to prioritize environmental issues. And you're hearing that at the county level, at the state level. Everyone's dealing with the same thing, with all of the regulation, with the fact that resources, we're not expanding budgets as much as I'd like to. I love the concept of an expanding budget. I've not seen that for a number of years. But it really is necessary to prioritize environmental issues all the more. But to do so, we need the flexibility from EPA on how to use federal funding and how, quite honestly, to count beans, how to account for that funding. With my colleagues, we also talk about the need to prioritize greater focus on science, on data collection and analysis, and on sharing this information. Environmental agencies have a lot of information. Sometimes we don't even share it internally very effectively, and so if there's a better way to share it among state agencies, between federal and state governments, and the same goes for technology. There's a lot going on out there with alternative technologies, with new technologies. And yet, regulatory agencies are so very focused on what they are supposed to do day in, day out. that often we don't hear about these new technologies in the way that we should, and there needs to be greater support, quite honestly, from EPA for these new technologies as well. We've seen the value of technology over the last 40 years. Lab equipment that once measured contaminants in parts per thousands now measures them in parts per billions. And all of our samples, once collected by hand, now we have automatic or continuous samplers, and of course all of these computerized. But with these advancements, uncertainties have in many ways also increased. When the seminal environmental laws came into being in the late 60s and 70s, yes, the environmental problems were more visible. And now the issues, you've heard it all day, have become more complex. Climate change and endocrine disruptors were not even on our radar screens at that time, and now they may be the most important issues of our time. Another challenge for environmental agencies is that we are not always the best communicators. Lo and behold, if you look at my agency, I've got lots of engineers and biologists and scientists, very technically minded people. Those types are not always, sometimes they are, but not always the best communicators. And yet all the more agencies have to become better at communicating their value, what they are accomplishing, two-way communication, but how they're communicating to the citizenry they serve. And with a society that is becoming more disconnected from nature, with no burning rivers nor mounds of trash to create the visible need for environmental protections, we have to find a way to more effectively communicate the public health risks and environmental challenges that exist and why the public should value natural resource protection. So this, of course, I believe is a challenge for many environmental agencies. But an aspect, I'll go back to this last slide, an aspect of that is two-way communication, the need to do a better job of engaging stakeholders in developing regulations. And this is where I believe engaging those we regulate at the front end does have value. And yes, they have different ways to persuade, the best way about going about something. But in the end, if you're either going to fight them on the front end or the back end, either in the courts or spending additional time with them on the front end, developing good regulations. And so the thing that has certainly changed for our agencies, and I think for other agencies, is the need to spend more time on the front end with stakeholder engagement and involvement. And we've had too many examples of without that, we end up in litigation and then with no regulations at all, or at least not for some period of time. My colleagues would say that there is the need to focus more of our efforts on planning. And I think I'm sorry, I've got to get this right. There we go. On planning and preventative efforts, in essence, efforts to support resiliency. In addition to our response efforts, we tend to be very response-oriented, reactionary agencies. We respond to a permit application. If there's an issue, we respond by inspection and enforcement. But all of us are suggesting that we need to spend more time on the front end, become better planners, spend more time discussing how to prevent environmental harm, to prevent environmental injury, rather than just react to it. And yet, without additional resources, how do we convince the public we serve of the value of that front-end effort? In essence, how do you communicate the value of what we are preventing versus what's been contaminated or damaged or cleaned up or restored? It's more challenging to do that, especially to a legislature who appropriates your budget. Going in there and asking for more planners doesn't tend to go well. Finally, we just need more tools to do our job, more flexible tools to meet the challenges that lie ahead. Yes, it's true, first generation command and control style environmental regulation has been successful, and it will continue to be, they will continue to be very important tools in our toolbox. For example, sources suggest that in 1972, only 1/3, one of these days I'm going to get this down, I promise. 1972, only 1/3 of the nation's waters were safe for fishing and swimming versus the 1990s, about 2/3 of the nation's waters were safe for fishing and swimming. Still, it is clear that we have work to do. EPA released a report in 2009, so these are old results, but still suggesting 44% of assessed river and stream miles were impaired, 64% of assessed lake acres still impaired. But while traditional tools of permitting, inspection, and enforcement provide certainty and technology-based standards, they also have limitations when there is greater uncertainty and complexity of environmental issues. So, we are seeing the expanded call at the federal and state levels for additional tools and flexibility. If you go to EPA's website, you will read about their next-gen compliance efforts. In essence, their effort to provide additional tools and flexibility. An example of that is their integrated planning initiative that they announced in the last couple of years. Integrated planning, as it applies to wastewater and stormwater issues, is a process through which a community identifies the broadest goals under the Clean Water Act that they have responsibility for, and it allows a community to identify those steps that most efficiently get the community to meet these broader goals. In essence, it lets the community identify priorities and establish a plan to reach compliance. In fact, we have a community now in Missouri, Springfield, Missouri, and I believe Boonville as well. By the way, does everybody know that David Shore is also a former DNR director? So at some point in time when he says, Sarah, that's not accurate, I tend to listen to you, because you served there for some period of years and appreciate your service. But we do see integrated planning that EPA is pushing for additional tools as well. This approach is not about lowering existing standards, but it is about identifying processes, procedures, capital investments that give the community the most bang for their buck in order to achieve goals in the desired results under the Clean Water Act. So, how are we evolving to address these challenges in Missouri? Well, we are focusing on improving communication and engagement of stakeholders and the use of technology and some of the things I mentioned earlier. We are trying to do a better job of an agency as just identifying our key messages and ensuring that we are speaking the language of the citizens that we serve rather than some of the very technical language sometimes we get caught up in. We've established stakeholder forms, and anyone is welcome to these stakeholder forms, but we have air forms, solid waste, hazardous waste, water forms. You can see the siloed nature of these forms, but that's how our regulations are now, and those forms have been very, very useful to identify issues and identify a path forward. We have what we call kitchen cabinets. We have them for the different sectors. We have an agricultural kitchen cabinet, business and industry kitchen cabinet, environmental kitchen cabinet, and local government kitchen cabinet. So at least twice a year we meet with identified leaders in each of these sectors, and they present their agenda to us. It gives us a great opportunity to have those loopbacks of information. We've really tried to use technology to create more transparency, so all of our commission meetings, we have over 20 boards and commissions in DNR, and many of these commissions with statutory authority to promulgate rules. So add that layer of complexity to it as well. But we offer web-based meetings so anyone can participate in the commission meetings. Because our stakeholders have asked for it, we are using technology to move all of our general permits to e-permits. So one by one, folks can get online, and rather than having to go the paper route, they can get different types of general permits online. Also, in the nature of transparency, we've taken many layers of data that the agency has, and we are posting these databases, interactive databases online. Two examples. One that just went online probably in the last 6 months is our long-term stewardship database. So hazardous waste cleanup sites, you can now click on interactive website and see that kind of information. We also have a geostrat, so it's geological and hydrological data also available, showing public use areas, springs, mines, sinkholes, so you can see the benefit for developers, for communities, for anyone to make sure that that information is much more accessible. And we have launched efforts just to better integrate data and science in order to better prioritize environmental issues. An example of that, right now I'm really behind, is an effort called Our Missouri Waters, which we launched about 2 years ago. This is Missouri's approach to planning at the watershed scale through involvement of the stakeholders in each watershed. At the Department of Natural Resources, and every state is different. Some states, these different functions are in different agencies, but I believe we're fortunate in Missouri in that we have the water quality function, the water planning function, the soil and water conservation function, other funding sources like SRF 319, all of those are in the same agency. So this really provides an opportunity, I think, to do much more effective watershed planning at the state level. So we look at the state at the 8-digit hydrologic unit level, meaning basically 66 watersheds. We have synchronized all of our water quality permits by watershed, which allows us greater flexibility to respond to the information that we're seeing in a given watershed. We have now transformed our state water planning efforts by watershed. We are targeting our soil and water dollars by watershed and engaging, most importantly, the local leadership in each watershed in these discussions. If government does it alone, it has very little value, or as you often see, and certainly in past lives, when government decides it has a great idea, it gathers its data up and goes out to the local community, and the community says, we want none of it. We don't even like the fact that you got all this data, and we certainly don't want you coming and telling us what to do. So we are making sure that this effort is driven from the locals, that they identify the priorities, that they know that they really are in the lead. But once they've identified those priorities, it helps us target our resources much more effectively and measure the success along the way. We have, just to make sure, because there is a lot of sensitivity in the heartland of the United States, how government uses this data, we've engaged an external advisory committee that's comprised of agricultural interests, business and industry interests, environmental interests, and they really kind of help us set the course of how we go about this approach, making sure that we don't step in it as it may be. And so it's been very, very beneficial to have them involved as well. Another way that we believe, perhaps, I don't know if this is third or fourth generation, but had I been here earlier, but we're also in the need to prioritize and looking at the resources, the technical resources, the regulatory tool, the financial resources our agency has. Where can we get the biggest bang for the buck? And what we're seeing in Missouri as well as in other Midwestern states is that there is this section of communities, maybe 500 to 5,000. It's not an exact science, but they are struggling. They oftentimes don't have full-time planning staff. They don't have full-time environmental staff. They may not have full-time operators of drinking water and wastewater systems. They don't have lobbyists, or that they're aware of anyway, that walk the halls of the Capitol. And yet they are struggling with additional federal, state regulation. They oftentimes are struggling with declining populations or aging populations. And there's even the new ammonia standard, I don't know if we've talked about that today, but that's creating a lot of consternation with these smaller communities. And we have a lot of tools to help them. So this is a very targeted effort to proactively, different than agencies have been in the past, but to proactively go out and communicate with these agencies, let them know of the engineering services we can offer, of the technical, managerial, financial assistance we can offer. We've got grants and other ways to encourage them to really think about their drinking water, wastewater infrastructure. We want to be there to help. And yes, we have regulatory tools, but we want to be more proactive in assisting them in those planning needs. In fact, we're contracting with Wichita State, with their Environmental Finance Center, to develop a matrix. And the state of Nebraska did this. We thought it was very useful, where there are lots of inputs on median household income and what's happening with populations, what other infrastructure costs do they have. So you input a lot of these additional burdens or factors that communities are facing, and you make a determination of basically where you're going to focus your efforts, and that includes your enforcement efforts. Where are we seeing the biggest environmental challenges? And sometimes these smaller communities with maybe a 2 or 3 cell lagoon, don't have the environmental issues that larger communities would have. And so, again, it is about prioritization. So by leveraging efforts and partnering with, and it's not just us alone, we are partnering with regional planning commissions, with Missouri Public Utility Alliance, Missouri Rural Water Association, in part because they have relationships, they have skills and equipment, they offer training. Sometimes they're the better face for these efforts than DNR. Sometimes, no matter what we're offering, they just don't want to see the regulatory agency coming in to help. And so by leveraging efforts with other entities, we're hoping that we really can provide these communities the services they need. Of course, we have the state revolving fund giving millions of dollars out each and every year, primarily in the form of loans, but we do have grants as well, engineering grants, 604B planning grants, and many other types of monies to provide to communities. Another tool that we have is that we use schedules of compliance, in which we have flexibility to allow a community to take longer if necessary in order to comply with regulation. We have a statutory obligation to make what we call affordability determinations for certain public entities, and these determinations typically support decisions regarding these schedules of compliance. So these are all tools. The department conducts these findings of affordability to help support the decision, which gives them extra time to pass bonds, conduct engineering, obtain additional monies, etc. So all of these are tools, including integrated planning, which again I mentioned at least one, if not two communities in Missouri are taking advantage of, are additional tools we are adding to our toolbox, focusing especially on communities. The last example that I will talk about is the use of adaptive management or collaborative adaptive management. Again, we're looking for all tools that we can to help us achieve environmental compliance, to provide us the flexibility that we need. And I want to talk a little bit now about the Hinkson. It's also called the Hink by the locals. And because it is a local waterway, I thought this might be a good example to spend a few minutes on. I think you've probably heard multiple definitions already today of adaptive management, so I'm not going to spend too much time here. And I think you've probably already seen the graphic as well. But it is an adaptive approach where there is particular uncertainty, and where there is the will to solve the problem. I think, one of the things that we've realized with adaptive management is it is only appropriate in certain cases, but there must be the will to resolve the issue, to resolve the uncertainty, to put in the resources and the time in order to be successful. So when there is a mandate to take action in the face of scientific uncertainty, when there is the institutional capacity and the commitment to initiate and sustain efforts, because sometimes these involve long-term monitoring and measuring and evaluation of outcomes. Also when there are consequential decisions to be made, when management objectives are clear and measurable, and when the value of reducing the uncertainty is high, all examples of when perhaps it's appropriate to use adaptive management. When we talk about collaborative adaptive management, this implies and requires the inclusion of stakeholders, oftentimes non-experts, from the community to be engaged in the process to assure public involvement, assure that the result responds to the community's needs, and promotes transparency. And it's CAM that we have used here in the Hinkson. So, let me tell you a little bit about the Hinkson. It drains roughly 88.5 square miles, all in Boone County. The Hinkson Creek itself is a 26-mile long creek originating northeast of Columbia and traveling through the southwest. Several large tributaries spill into the Hinkson Creek within the Columbia area, including Grindstone Creek, Hominy Branch, Flat Branch, and other branches. It is an urban watershed, and it's not meeting water quality standards because it lacks the biological diversity one would expect to find in a stream its size. Of course, under the Clean Water Act, the default is that all jurisdictional streams and lakes should be fishable and swimmable. Of course, there's higher conditions where warranted, and lower standards only when proven necessary. Of course, assessments of water bodies are done every 2 years under the 304B report. And when bodies do not meet water quality standards, they are placed on the impaired waters list or the 303D list. Waters on this list require a plan that may set permit limits for a particular pollutant for all point sources in the watershed, and of course this also may affect incentives for non-point source pollution as well. So this plan is called a Total Maximum Daily Load Plan, or TMDL, and it is used to develop limits for pollutants of concern. Now, the problem with the Hinkson is that though water quality standards were not being met, a particular pollutant or pollutants could not be identified. And so, finalizing the TMDL, well, it was challenging. So, enter lawsuit number 1. American Canoe Association versus EPA. Environmental groups sued the EPA, saying Missouri was not making sufficient progress on completing TMDLs for waters in Missouri. So by federal consent decree in 2001, deadlines were set for completing TMDLs. And in 2011, EPA finalized the TMDL for the Hinkson and a few other water bodies in Missouri to ensure the deadline was met. In this TMDL, EPA proposed to use stormwater reduction, in fact 39.6% reduction, as a proxy for a particular pollutant. The locals objected. Did they not, Mr. Shore?
They did.
They were not too happy about EPA's TMDL. They did not want to implement the TMDLs proposed. They suggested that 39.6% of a reduction in stormwater was not based in science, and that EPA did not have authority to regulate pollutants via stormwater flow, and that to reduce stormwater by 39.6 would be very costly and still might not meet water quality standards. Enter lawsuit number 2. Local entities that hold the stormwater permit filed suit against the city, county, and the University of Missouri, filed suit against the EPA saying stormwater is not a pollutant and thus stormwater flow cannot be used as a surrogate for other pollutants. This case was resolved once, of course, the settlement using a collaborative adaptive management was in place. So, now enter the state of Missouri. The state has the authority to implement the TMDLs. We saw the concern about how best to move forward, and it was suggested that perhaps adaptive management might be a good way forward. So, in fact, we thought collaborative adaptive management, because of all the stakeholder interest, because they were so vested in this TMDL, that would be the best way to proceed. So why collaborative adaptive management in this case? Well, because the process and the decisions would be based in science, because we needed a path forward in the face of scientific complexity and uncertainty, because there was uncertainty regarding which actions might produce what results, and because we would take into account actions that have already been completed by the permit holders. Stormwater ordinances had been put into place in the recent years, and other issues. There was an issue of significant concern to local stakeholders, and the process not only included stakeholder involvement, but it needed stakeholder involvement to move it along and to have the commitment. The end goal for the collaborative adaptive management process is compliance with water quality standards, not, some would say, an arbitrary number. EPA probably wouldn't, but not an arbitrary number of stormwater reduction. But in this case, the end goal is compliance with water quality standards. It is restoring biological integrity and health to the stream. So what does the Hinkson Collaborative Adaptive Management Agreement include? Well, we have a stakeholder committee. This is a 15-member committee comprised of community leaders from the city, the county, the University of Missouri, Department of Natural Resources, business, agriculture, and environmental groups. The stakeholder committee's role is to make recommendations to the 3 local partners, the city, county, and the university. This group meets monthly. EPA facilitates these meetings. It was clearly important to have EPA's engagement and involvement in support of this, and so they are actually facilitating this process. We also have an action team. The action team is comprised of City, County, and University of Missouri engineering and planning staff, and their main role is to provide information on actions that might work to achieve the goals. And so they suggest actions, and it is the Stakeholder Committee that will either approve or disapprove those actions. Finally, there is the science team. The science team has representatives from major natural resource agencies, including the Department of Conservation, USGS, University, EPA, and DNR, and they guide the scientific aspects of the process. So, major actions taken. The agreement was signed in April of 2012 by EPA, DNR, City, County, and University, and the process started that same month. Stakeholders spent most of the first 6 months on the education about the Hinkson, the current status, what did the current data suggest, and the sciences, and so that everybody on the stakeholder group, because they were the decision makers, would understand. First decision was in November 2012, in which we began to move forward on a two-phased habitat assessment using GIS and direct examination of the stream and its valley. Thank you, University of Missouri students who actually walked to the entire Hinkson and provided much of the data input. We have other projects that are underway as well, and so the science team and the action team must agree on projects before they're taken forward to the Stakeholder Committee. And to date, we believe it's working. We believe it's a good model. There still is a lot of work to be done. We know it still may be a long road, and some of the challenges include the fact that this approach is built on uncertainty. The mayor and city council may say, how long is this going to take? And we have to say, we don't know. How much will this cost? We have to say, we don't know. So it clearly takes continued commitment. We know that we're likely to go through at least 2016 to 2018, and of course, elections can change things. Changes of administration and environmental agencies can change things. So institutional continuity is a concern. Of course, it relies on continued funding, and there are political realities that go along with that. But there is a funding agreement in place in which the 3 permit holders have agreed on how to fund the projects as they move forward. And of course, these are not typically short-term projects or long-term projects. So it does take continued support and continued political will. And it takes making sure that you're engaging not only your stakeholder committee, but the general public. There is a website, the Hinkson.org, and this provides all the documents you could imagine, the TMDL and data as it's posted, the actions, meetings of the Stakeholder Committee and the other groups. And so this is one of the ways that we keep the general public in Boone County organized or involved. Also, there is to be a symposium next January in which the committees will report out their actions and their progress to date. So, in the what is the ending, or what is success? And it really is, as I mentioned earlier, meeting water quality standards for the protection of aquatic life, or identifying a pollutant. And if a specific pollutant is identified, then the TMDL process will work as it was designed. So clear goals, and that's another key aspect of adaptive management, is making sure you have clear goals. We don't believe that collaborative adaptive management has ever been used to address a TMDL before. We know, of course, it's been used in the Everglades and other restoration projects, Missouri River and others, but we're not aware of a time in which it's been used to address a TMDL. So, another example of a flexible tool. So in the end, what is the future? DNR is 40 years old this year. Changes we've seen, improvements in science and technology and environmental protection. What will the next 40 years hold for us? We know that the impact of pollution may not be as visibly evident as it was 40 years ago, but that there is still work to do. And the department's monitoring efforts document this fact. Our next set of environmental challenges will include some obstacles that we will have to overcome together with due diligence, sound science, flexibility, and collaborative approaches. Yes, pressures are great to solve complex environmental issues, and yes, we are trying to balance economics versus environment. And yes, we need to better message environmental protection, and that environmental protection and economic vitality are not mutually exclusive. We need to do a better job of defining and messaging the value of environmental protection from a public health standpoint. And we must identify different tools to accomplish this end. We must improve the science and the technology. In essence, we must learn as we go and have the legal framework to accomplish this. We must be adaptive in our approach. But with these challenges, I personally could not ask for a more worthy mission. I am very grateful for the opportunity to serve the state in my role as the lead regulator, and hope that our efforts today will make a difference in 40 years. I love the quote by Gaylord Nelson, former governor of Wisconsin and the founder of Earth Day, who said, "The ultimate test of man's or woman's conscience may be his or her willingness to sacrifice something today for future generations whose words of thanks will not be heard." Thank you.
The TMDL planning, does that give you guys the flexibility to deal with things that like happened in 2012? I was afraid you were going to give a horror story that we had a drought, that there were a lot of streams that were healthy before.
That's right.
Dried up and then they have to repopulate.
It does give us that flexibility, and in fact, we have a fairly rigorous data collection framework, and there were portions of the watershed that simply couldn't be monitored in the fall of 2012 due to the drought. But that framework, that conceptual framework, does allow for that flexibility.
I'm wondering, so you talked a lot about symposiums, spreading the word, creating like local leaders to create sustainability, but I'm wondering how you are engaging the average citizen in these efforts, because it seems like there's a disconnect.
You know, that's an excellent point. And everyone here, she's like, you know, you're talking to a lot of your regulated stakeholders and, you know, environmental groups, those that have an interest. How are you connecting with the common citizen? And that's an excellent point. We have a General Assembly that is not real keen on, in fact, there was I don't know, several years ago, some of the agencies had magazines, we still do, we had to cut one of the issues, but that had some of those tools, calendars, magazines. There's the other environmental agency or natural resource agency, you'll even see billboards on the highways. By the way, they don't have any general revenue, so they don't have to go through the same appropriation process that we do. But several years ago, the legislature said it is not agencies' jobs to spend money on communicating like this. Your job is to regulate. Your job is to administer the laws. And so you find that I struggle with that because, again, we're here because of the public will. The things that agencies do has value to the common citizen. We feel like we have a need to communicate what it is we are doing, but there's a little tension there with what is an agency's role in communicating. We want to make sure that we're messaging effectively, but what is that role? We've got a website, we try to draw people in through other means, but we did some focus groups this last summer to kind of identify those key messages I talked about. And interestingly, we had our regional offices just find kind of small, medium, large business owners and different citizens to come in and engage with us. What we heard from many of them was, I don't need to know everything you're doing, I just need to know you're doing your job. I don't want to hear all the details of all your programs and all the data, I just want to know you're doing your job. So so finding that balance between, they don't want to hear from us all the time, but they do want to know, because they believe government has a role, they do want to know that we're doing our jobs. I think I've worn them out. They're just worn out. But anyway, hey, thank you so much. Yeah.